So avidya or ignorance, as I said, is the one that leads us to prayas. Prayas is what that binds us in samsara. Okay, this is a bird's eye view of prayas. It is the prayas that binds us in samsara. And as you know, the Vedic view is life goes in eternal cycles, and we are having these eternal cycles of births and deaths. So what happens? We have a gross body. And when we are here for 10 years, 100 years, we do all sorts of activities that lead us towards prayers. All the things that we discussed as examples in the previous slide. So when we do those activities that lead us to prayers, what happens? We incur a lot of karmic impressions on our subtle bodies. So when the body dies, when the gross body after 100 years dies and perishes, the soul carries on with its journey, but it has accumulated a lot of karmas because of the activities of praise that it has done. Now, based on its karmic imprints, it acquires another body. And then again, if it chooses to do a lot of activities leading to prayers, it is going to incur more karmas and then go through these cycles. You know, this is an never ending cycles of birth and death is what happening here, largely driven by avidya or prayers. This is, as you know, is the cycle of samsara. So I'm going to take a small quiz here. Who is going to tell me what is agnotology? Has anybody heard of this term called agnotology?
Study of agnotism.
What is agnotism, Sudarshan?
Agnotism is not atheism. Yeah. So it's like, it's not like, it doesn't say there is no God. It just leaves everything a bit generalized. And so I don't believe in God, but I don't believe in no God as well.
Okay, so that's interesting. That's agnostic. So you're coming from an agnostic perspective. Okay, I see where you're coming from, but you're slightly related, but not quite. So anybody else want to take a guess or an educated guess here? What is agnotology? Okay, agnotology in Western philosophy. Sorry, somebody had something? Yes. No.
I'm just,
it's
just guessing. Sorry.
Go for it. Who is going to get
about
first? Sheilaji?
Is it about ignorance, knowledge of, I mean, to get knowledge about ignorance and get over the ignorance or whatever it is? It has to be something with ignorance because we are talking about ignorance.
Okay, good guess.
It's
Thank you, Sheilaji. Yeah, thank you. Neetaji, Sushruth, you had a contribution.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same, study of ignorance.
Yeah, excellent. So the Western philosophy and the neurobiology of the study of ignorance is actually called agnotology. So it's a new term that I also learned recently. So it's something for you to think about. So study of ignorance is called agnotology. Okay. See, look at the word agnotology. That is again Sanskrit. Okay. Ajnana. Yeah. Look at ajnana. Ajnana is ignorance. And what have our friends, Western philosophers done? Taken ajnana and converted into agnotology. Okay, so I hope you find this interesting. So I'm always looking for these kind of connections because everything is, the Indo-European languages have their origins in Sanskrit. So when you start looking at these words, it makes sense. So ajnana, the study of ajnana is called agnotology. Okay, so what is ignorance? Who has it? So these are all the questions. Okay, so now is I hope is an interesting biological slide for those of us who are of medical, neurological, psychological, psychiatric predisposition, scientific predisposition. In this audience, I've got some interesting new ideas about neurobiology of ignorance. Okay, so if you do a bit of a literature search, there's quite a lot of scientific studies and papers. Pragnesh.
Madhuji, I need to take 1 minute to introduce Paul Magyar, whom I have invited, who is a friend, who is a neurosurgeon, but more importantly, he is a neuroscientist. He has worked with Dr. Ramchandran, whom I quoted last time. He has done a lot of work on phantom limb, and he will be the right person to say something on this. Paul, if you
Okay.
want to express, please do so. Thank you very much. Sorry for that.
Oh, yeah, fantastic. So thank you, Pragnesh and Paul. Welcome to our forum. And of course, we'll be delighted to hear your views on this. But hear me out on this. I'm just an oncologist who's interested in this subject. So I'm not an expert in this, but I'm going to explain the neurobiology, or what is the very, very basic understanding of what ignorance is. Yeah, and whether where I'm getting at is whether ignorance actually exists or not. So that is the core philosophical question that I wanted to explore here. Okay, so the first point, so I want to focus on the left side of this slide. Ignorance is not merely absence of knowledge. Okay, so this is a key concept. It is not just a mere absence of knowledge, it is a positive experience of ignorance. Okay, so the example for that is, we say I am ignorant of this. I don't say I do not have knowledge of this. We always say I am ignorant. Okay, so ignorance is a neurobiological phenomenon. And why do I say that? So when I was doing my research, there is this whole concept of something called meta-ignorance, which is a neurocognitive mechanism in the brain-mind complex that happens. Now, I was looking at a paper, I think it was published in PNAS, I think, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, which actually did a bit of an experiment in primates to understand whether primates have an experience of ignorance. Okay, so this study, without going into the details of it, I just want to summarize the key abstract from this. Metacognitive judgments on non-experienced events are processed in the frontopolar cortex of the brain, whereas the metacognition on experienced events is associated with dorsal prefrontal cortex. That is in primates, so you could extrapolate into the human brain, which is very closely related. So from this, what I understand is, so this experience of the metacognitive experience of ignorance is, so for example, your brain will actually be searching whether you've had an experience of something before or not. And if you have not experienced something before, then it will understand that this is an ignorance that you have of something that you have never experienced before. Okay, it seems a very abstract statement, but think about it. So ignorance in that sense is something that is happening in the brain. And we know in the brain, it is not just glials, astrocytes, and so many other things are there. And of course, electrical activity, neurochemicals, synapses, all those complexes operate in the brain. And that gives you this problem of ignorance. So from a neurobiological perspective, ignorance is a material phenomenon. And how does this material phenomenon happen in the brain? There is always a time-space correlation. There is always a space and a time when this ignorance happens. Where is that space? In the brain. Where is that time? At one particular point, tomorrow morning, you might get an ignorance of something. So there is also always a time-space correlation to ignorance. Okay, and why do I say that there is always a time-space correlation? Because Vedic philosophers, particularly from the realistic or the theistic schools of Vedanta, have classified that anything that has a space-time correlation is real. Reality is defined as that which has a space and a time correlation. Anything that does not have a space-time correlation is not real. Okay, that is the theistic or the realistic schools of Vedanta's perspective. So that is about the neurobiology of ignorance. So now there is this concept of forgetting, isn't it? Sometimes you forget about things. So who is going to be explaining to us here what is the difference between what ignorance is and what is forgetting something is? So anybody wants to take a view on this? Anybody in the audience, including Paul, would be hugely welcome.
Hey, Madhu, ignorance is not knowing at all. Forgetfulness is knowing in the first place and then not able to recollect it.
Okay, very good. Yeah, anybody else? As a view, Deval, did you have something?
It's Paul here, Pragnesh. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for inviting me today. And thank you. It's very, very interesting. I would say that just as the last speaker said, that it's this mismatch, but also I'd implicate the insula particularly the anterior insula in the brain, I think is particularly implicated in the right side in this mismatch. And I think with ignorance, the right side's more involved in detecting something awry, sympathetic activation, whereas the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where you know that you know it, but you can't quite bring it forward, is probably more aligned to the left side, which actually is involved more with parasympathetic function, this sort of energy nourishing function, as opposed to energy expenditure that the right side exerts.
Fantastic, Paul. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. I didn't know about this right-left differences of ignorance and forgetting. Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. Anybody else has anything else to contribute here? Okay, so we will move on. So that forgetting is a forgetting something is a neurobiological phenomenon. And Pragnesh, yes? No, that must have been a historic hand.
Yeah, by error. Thank you.
Yeah, so forgetting is again an active mechanism in the brain. Yeah, so and that is a lot of new studies, at least the research that I have done, indicates clearly that when you forget something, it is an active process. It is not just, so how does this operate? So you have memory, and the memory goes into your consciousness. In your brain networks, you have the memories, and then when the memory eventually goes, you forget. So there was one view before that loss of memory, which is what forgetting is, was a very passive phenomenon. So it is just the nerve synapses wear off and then you forget something, was the previous view. But now there is a prevailing view that loss of that synaptic connections leading to forgetting is actually an active process in the brain. Now, Paul was mentioning about some neurotransmitters. I also found some articles talking about dopamine, as how that is essential for forgetting. And AMPA receptors are also important in that process of forgetting. How GABA is also involved, and how hippocampus and the cortex are involved in this process. And there is a lot of research going in this area, particularly linking it with Alzheimer's disease, for example, to understand what is that active process and how could that active process be slowed down so that you don't forget. Yeah. So there is this ignorance and the forgetting, the two aspects, but again, they are happening in the brain-mind complex, if you like. And again, that is a material phenomenon. Okay. And again, that is happening in a space-time correlation. Again, from a theistic, realistic school of Vedantic philosophy, this is a real event. This is not some imagination or an illusion. This is a real event. So I hope this slide summarizes the two concepts of ignorance and forgetting, and how from one particular school of Vedantic philosophy, it is actually a real event in this situation happening in the brain, which is made of matter. Okay, so that is where I am leading to. So what is the Vedic perspective of this? So when you have the neurobiological understanding of ignorance and forgetting, what do our Vedic rishis think about this problem? Okay, so let's go through the fundamentals here. So you have the soul, you have inside the soul is the Antaryamin, or the Brahman, or the God as we call it. Now the material coverings of the soul, there are 5. Annamaya Kosha, Pranamaya Kosha, Manonmaya Kosha, Vijnanamaya Kosha, and Anandamaya Kosha. So I'm going to pause for a minute. I'm going to get one of you to describe these 5 koshas. What are the components of the koshas, please? The answers are there in the slide, but give your own views on this. So who wants to go for this?
Yeah, Annamaya Kosha is the food, isn't it? Food, and the Pranamaya Kosha is our breath, and Manomaya Kosha is the mind. Vijnanamaya Kosha, well, I don't know how you say that. It's well, you put it there as well. It's a chit, and Anandamaya Kosha is ultimate, the final one.
Okay, thank you, Sudarshan. Anybody else wants to contribute, or I can just press on? Any other views there about what is chitta and what is chetana?
Madhu, does Pranamaya Kosha or Prana deal with neurobiology?
Okay, thank you. Yes, possibly, but it's more in the Manas Buddhi Ahankara situation, Shilaji, but it's a combination of both. Yeah, I agree. So first one, if you take, is Annamaya Kosha is the grossest of the body, made of food. The food that we eat, yeah, is the Annamaya Kosha that gets transformed into this gross body. Then, of course, you have the Vayu, Tejas, and Akasha, the air, the fire, and the space. That forms a Pranamaya Kosha, and that's very relevant. Several months ago we discussed this, isn't it? Oxidative phosphorylation, the metabolism, the metabolism that happens in your body needs air, oxygen, and it needs space, where through the nose, that space, the air goes in, and the tejas is the fire. And the oxidative phosphorylation is what metabolism is. And that essentially is the pranamaya kosha, which determines whether something is living or not. We know something is living when it is breathing, yeah, in and out. So that is the pranamaya kosha. And then, of course, the manas, buddhi, and ahankara, as Sudarshan rightly pointed out, is the manonmaya kosha. That is the mind, the covering, that covering of the soul, which has the mind functions. Manas, and we know that mind has got 5 layers of functioning, isn't it? Manas, buddhi, ahankara, chitta, and chetana. So what are these things? So manas is the most superficial aspect of the mind's function, where it receives the sensory inputs from the sense organs. Buddhi, as you know, is it tries to discriminate as to what is right and what is wrong. And then the ahankara component of the brain will say, it brings that I-ness into that and said, I have made this decision that I want to do this, or I want to have this. So when that happens, what is the next sequence? It then, as you do more and more of these mental things, it goes into the memory. It goes, these things get stored in memory. Exactly the neurobiological view. So it gets stored in memory. So that covering of the jiva, where the memory is stored, is called the chitta. Chitta is that memory storage. Whereas chetana is the deep memory, as it's called. Deep memory means not just memory of your childhood, but the Vedic philosophers also say that this is the memory of even of your past lives. So the deep memories are all stored in chetana. Chitta layer is where the memories of your current birth is. And then, of course, manas, buddhi, and ahankara feed this into the memory circuits. Okay. So for our discussion, I had to talk about neurobiology and come to panchakoshas to introduce this concept of chitta and chetana, which is a covering of the jivas where the memory and deep memory is. And by corollary, ignorance is also here. So ignorance is also in the memory and deep memory coverings of the jiva, which resonates quite well with the neurobiological view at this point of time. Okay, so remember, the chitta and chetana is where the memory is. Memory is knowledge. Yeah, what you have experienced, you've stored, that is your knowledge. Ignorance is absence or a positive experience of ignorance. Yeah. So that is another interesting concept where you can apply modern biology and Vedic philosophy. Okay, so now I've got a question here, because our next few slides is going to take us through this journey of souls and how this ignorance actually comes about from a Vedic perspective. So who is going to take this one on? I've just got to put a question here. Where are souls before coming into creation? And I got a clues in the slide, but I want one of you to explain that. Before this universe came into creation, where were the souls? Where were they placed? Were they even there or not? If they were there, where were they? What is the view here from the Vedic scriptures? Who is going to take that one?
They were in the womb of Lord Vishnu.
Padmajaji, can you repeat that again?
They were in the womb of Lord Vishnu, in the stomach.
Okay, womb of Lord Vishnu. Okay, fantastic, Padmaja. Anybody else? Okay.
Hiranya Garbha is the same, no?
Yeah, Pratibhaji, yeah, excellent. Yeah, very good.
They were also with the subtle matter of Mula Prakriti, a part of the subtle matter.
Sorry, Devalji, we lost you in the first few lines. You want to repeat that?
They were also sitting along with the subtle matter.
Yeah, brilliant. Yes, thank you. So, yeah. Sorry, another person? Somebody else wanted to contribute? Okay, no worries. So I'll keep going. So yeah, all of us got the points here absolutely right. So the Vedic view is before creation, this is just a symbolic representation, right? And we have discussed this a million times, that this Vishnu lying on this snake and Lakshmi next to him, and there is this navel from which Chaturmukha is there, and then he is sitting on a lotus with 14 petals, is a purely symbolic representation of deep philosophical concepts. So what is a deep philosophical concept? The deep philosophical concept, as you guys rightly pointed out, is these jivas, these souls that are infinite in number, yeah, they are in the womb of the Supreme before coming into creation. And when the creation starts, and as we have read in Srimad Bhagavatam, as how that stages of creation goes in 9 stages, then we have seen how this Chaturmukha Brahma comes up. And then how Chaturmukha Brahma, then the whole Brahmanda concept comes. And then how this 14-petal lotus signifies 14 levels of the universe. 7 below earth and 7 above earth, and various layers and complexities of the universe is the 17 petals. And of course, our souls, that is you and I, at the dawn of creation, we emanate from the womb of the Supreme. Okay, now here is an important point that you need to understand. Souls have always, although Devalji mentioned very briefly that the souls and the Mula Prakriti, that is the Mula Prakriti is the primordial matter that then becomes a Big Bang and the universe evolves. That primordial matter is always there pre-creation, but it is there along with the jivas or the souls. And the souls always have a material sheath. There was never a time that the souls did not have a material covering, a very, very subtle material covering. Souls lose their material covering only at the point of liberation. When they go to the eternal heaven, that is when they lose their material coverings. But until that point, they always have a subtle material covering, or the Linga Sharira as it's called. Okay. Linga Sharira is also called Karana Sharira, and that is made of matter, very subtle matter that the souls have always been eternally, Anadi Nitya. They always had that. Okay, and this is an idea that I hope you will take it in, because unless you take this view into account, you may not be able to fully appreciate what I'm getting at in the subsequent slides. Okay, so it is this Linga Sharira where the karmic imprints are. And the Vedic Rishi's view is it is in the Linga Sharira where the ignorance is. So that particular ignorance is called cosmic ignorance. There are different stages or levels of ignorance that is there. So there is one concept called the cosmic ignorance. That cosmic ignorance is ingrained in this Linga Sharira, which is Chetana and Chitta and Chetana. This deep coverings, the subtlest coverings of the souls are the Linga Shariras, where the cosmic ignorance is. This is where the deep memory is also there. So as a corollary, there is also deep cosmic ignorance that is there. So when the souls come into creation along with the material universe, they are actually carrying the imprints of all the previous births that they might have had. Okay, and they, of course, the creation for a soul is uncreated. Yes, that is our Vedantic view. But the uncreated soul is created in the sense that it acquires a gross body. So that gross body is what we call a Stula Sharira, and it acquires and it goes through its activities of life. Yeah, so that is the bird's eye view of what is happening. So I just want to expand this further. Okay, so I'm going to call upon Shushrut to take us through some of this. So Shushrut, just be ready with this, but I'm going to start off with some basics here. So as I said in the previous slide, souls come out during creation, but they always have the subtle material covering called the Linga Sharira. Okay. And then, of course, we know that once the Big Bang has happened and the material universe starts evolving. So, Mula Prakriti, and what did our Brahman say? Om Atataha. And then those vibrations in the primordial matter then starts, that vibrations are started. And once the vibration happens, the various components of subtle matter starts mixing with each other. Yeah, and we spoke about how the various entities come through. So, Shushrut, do you want to take us through this?
I'll try. I may have some parts of ignorance, so please excuse that. As you said, the three elements are sattva, rajas, and tamas, and once they start mixing after the subtle vibrations, then the next stage is the creation of Mahat, and the Abhimani Devata of that is Brahma, if I'm correct. Is that right?
Yeah. Go, keep going.
Then it continues to evolve into the next level, which is Ahankara, and the Abhimani Devata of that is Rudra. Then there become three further parts to Ahankara, which is the Vaikarika, Tejas, and Tamasa. And then there is further evolvement into the Panchabhutas and Panchatanmatras, and Tejas evolves into the five Indriyas, and then Vaikarika manifests into Manas.
Okay, excellent, Sushil. Yeah, so very well done. So Mula Prakriti, as Sushil said, it becomes, there are three components, right? Tamas, Rajas, and Sattva. Shri, Bhu, and Durga, Abhimani is for that. So Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And these subtle matters, they mix with each other. Initially that Mahat, but a component of the Mahat becomes Ahankara. Then that is also a part of, it is a very subtle matter. And that very subtle matter then differentiates into three aspects: Vaikarika, Tejasa, and Tamasa, and then they evolve further. So you start from the subtlest of matter to the grossest of the matter, which is the five bhutas. So who is going to tell us what the five bhutas here are, please? So what are the five panchabhutas?
Yeah, earth, fire, water, air, and the cosmic, like the space.
Okay, yes, fine. So you always take it in order: Akasha, Vayu, Tejas, Aap, Annam. So from the subtlest to the grossest, Annam is the grossest. So that is the Annam is the earth, the solid state is the grossest. So those are the five bhutas. Now, why are we discussing this here? It is very important to discuss here because, as I told you, there are three types of matter. And if you recall that the sessions on creations that we did, and how we said our elementary particle physicists talk about fermions, which then mix up together, form semi-quarks, quarks, and then the subatomic particles, and the electrons, protons, and then they become matter and so on. And those three types of fermions, you may recall that we discussed that. Similarly, the Vedic rishis also says that there are three types of matter, tamas, rajas, and sattva, that mix together, and then the whole universe evolves. So the key points to remember that is, when these three guys mix with each other, you get the Mahat Tattva and then Ahankara Tattva. But remember, they are a mixture of these three, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. So they do have a component of these. Yeah, Sattva, Rajas, Tamas, Sattva, Rajas, Tamas. Yeah, the matter that has those properties. So remember that one. And then also remember your Mahat Tattva and Tejasa component of Ahankara Tattva, they together form the Buddhi, or the intellect aspect of the material creation for souls. And Vaikarika becomes the mind. So Buddhi and mind is important for our discussion because we are doing a lot of neurobiology and mind and ignorance and knowledge. So this Buddhi and Manas becomes interesting, and they are made up of Mahat and Tejasa, which again have Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Those are the three components that make it up. Okay. Now then, of course, you have your Indriyas, then you have Panchabhutas, your Panchabhutas. So what do these guys do? These Panchabhutas are the ones that make your gross body. Yeah. So the gross body is made of your Panchabhutas. Yeah, I don't think we have any confusions there. So if you talk about that, your brain is also a gross matter. Your brain is also made of Panchabhutas. Yeah, so the brain also then has Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas components of matter. And Krishna in his Bhagavad Gita, so many places he has discussed that it is the Tamas that leads to ignorance. The Tamas type of matter, which talks about ignorance, inertia. So maybe somebody can talk to us about Tamas and the view from Gita. Maybe Neetaji, you want to say something about Tamas and ignorance?
It is described mostly in 14th chapter, Rajas, Tamas, and Sattva. That leads, Tamas leads to it's laziness. So, and also ignorance. So I'm sorry, I can't explain.
That's fine. That's fine, Thomas. So inertia, laziness, ignorance, those are all the components that characterizes tamas, right? So now it makes sense when Krishna talks about the states of the mind and brain and how tamas leads to ignorance and so on. It is because what are we? We got two components, right? We are actually souls. We are sitting inside that space in the thymus. Yeah, and inside us is the antaryam, and we are sitting there. There are two types of cover. There are 5 sheets, but for our discussion, you take 2 coverings there. One is the subtle sheet where the cosmic ignorance is, and then you have the gross body that we have occupied as humans with the brain sitting right on the top, and which has also got this tamas component, which leads to ignorance. So those are the 2 components, the cosmic ignorance and the ignorance of the mundane world and our relationship with it. So that is how that ignorance evolves in Vedantic philosophy. Okay, so far I think I have told you enough to impress upon you the fact that from a neurobiological perspective and in the Vedic perspective, anything that has a space-time correlation is real, and that is the theistic Vedanta. Okay, so I'm going to first take about the view of ignorance in the theistic Vedanta, and we will talk about the view of ignorance in the school of monism, and then compare and contrast, and then you can make a decision as to which is appealing to you. The reason why this is important is, remember, let us not forget that we are actually doing Kataka Upanishad, where there is a discussion between Nachiketa and Yama. So I don't want to digress from that, but actually the very next verse that Yama says is very, very relevant to this discussion about ignorance, and that is the reason why I thought it is important that we have this conversation. Okay, so let's take in realistic school, what is happening. So realistic school, what is the view of ignorance, which is also called Avidhya or Maya, which is what I've said, one meaning of Maya is ignorance. So in the realistic school of Vedantic philosophy, there are only 2 things in existence. Okay, there are only 2 ontological categories in existence. One is called Sat and the other one is called Asat. What does that mean? One that is existent and the others are non-existent. So there are only 2 ontological categories in all of theistic philosophy, Sat and Asat. Okay, and as we have discussed, Avidya or ignorance is a product of tamas, which is a component of Prakriti, which is a real entity under Supreme's control. Okay, so there cannot be any second view on this from a realistic school of Vedanta. And this ignorance is on the soul. And as I told you, the Linga Sharira and how the Jivas are in the womb of the Supreme, and that Linga Sharira where the ignorance is only covering the soul, not this bird here. It's only covering this bird, which is the Jiva. So that is the theistic view. This is called Swabhava Ajnanavada in realism. Okay, now come to this side, and this is important because what do we do as souls? We take in all these sensory inputs, process this in the brain and the mind, and then it goes into deep memory and we experience it. Soul is the experiencer in the realistic schools. Soul is the experiencer of all the pleasures and pains of material existence, and the soul is also the experiencer of ignorance. Okay, and soul is the doer. Any doership that happens comes from the soul. And we have discussed this before. There is a famous verse of Vedavyasa called Rachana Anupapatteshta Na Anumanam. That means self-initiated activity cannot come from an insentient being. No insentient being can actually have ability for self-initiated action. A stone cannot decide and transform itself into a sculpture of some type. No, it can't. A stone does not feel pain. A stone cannot read and write. Yeah. It is only the sentient being who are capable of self-initiated action of various types. So that is the view of Vedavyasa in this very famous sutra, Rachana Anupapatteshta Na Anumanam. So if you take that view, then the soul is the experiencer of everything and also the experience of ignorance. Soul is also the doer of everything. Okay, so ignorance of the material world around us, we know, is neurobiological. here is the important point that is essential for philosophical progress. Cosmic ignorance is in Linga Sharira. But what is that cosmic ignorance? That cosmic ignorance is the ignorance of our true nature. Shastras call this as Jivachadika. Ignorance of God, Paramachadika. Ignorance of the nature of things, thereby producing longings and desires. So that's called Shaivala. Or ignorance of our dependence on him as our controller. So these are all the cosmic ignorance. So you could memorize these points. Ignorance of the Jiva Swabhava, or the nature of us as souls. Ignorance of God, who is sitting very next to us. Ignorance of our relationship with the material things. So those are the cosmic ignorance that actually leads us to samsara and the cycles of birth and death. Whereas then you have the neurobiological ignorance of the material world once we have acquired gross bodies. So there is this subtle change, difference that you have to understand. Okay, and what I've also listed here is some very, very key statements from the Upanishads. We have done this before, and I'm quite keen to look at this again. Anadi mayaya shuptaha yada jivaha prabudyate ajam anidram aswapnam advaitam budyate tada. This is a very, very important verse of Mandukya Upanishad, which, as you know, is a part of Atharva Veda. So what does that say here? Look, I put this box, Jivaha, Anadi Mayaya Shuktaha Yada Jivaha. So these Jivas eternally have been covered by this Linga Sharira, and they have the ignorance eternally. One view. If you take God's Mahima and Icha as the meaning of Maya, then that means by the will of the Supreme, because of his greatness, he has made it so that the Jivas, or the souls, start their careers as souls in creation with ignorance, and then they work out their salvation. That is their hard work that they have to do in samsara. And what kind of hard work the Jivas have to do? They have to know the Supreme. How is that Supreme known as? Ajam, Anidram, Aswapnam, Advaitam, Buddhyate Tada. So Mandukya, go back to our lectures on Mandukya. These words we discuss in great detail. I have underlined Advaitam here. And again, I will, in my next slide, I want to talk briefly about Advaitam there, because that is a contextually, it has a different meaning. Yeah. So again, Samsara Moksha Sthiti Bandha Hetuhu, Shvetashvatara Upanishad. Who wants to recite 15.5? Who wants to take Gita 15.5? That again talks about this concept of ignorance. Pragnesh, go for it.
Thank you. Sarvasya chayam radisannivishto mata smritigyanam pohanam cha.
Thank you, Pragnesh. So, smritir jnanam apohanam cha. Okay, smriti means memory. Jnanam means knowledge. Apohanam means ignorance. Mattaha. I am the one that gives them all this. Okay, very, very clear. Skanda Purana. Bandako bhavapashena bhavapashascha mochakaha. Kaivalyadaha param brahma vishnureva sanatanaha. So these are all key verses of scriptures that talk about how this ignorance actually is given by the Supreme to the Jivas, so that is their examination of life, that they have to pass that exam. Okay, so here is for your attention, the key concept of realism. In realism, ignorance is real. Only when something really exists, there is a question of its eradication. Okay. Only when there is a real disease, there is a question of its eradication by a physician or a surgeon or anybody. If the disease itself is not really existing, there is no reason why one has to eradicate something that does not exist. Okay, so this is a key view of the theistic schools of Vedanta, which consider ignorance as real. Okay, now I want to just finish this realistic view of ignorance by taking this word Advaitam, because that has been misinterpreted, and there is a lot of confusion in some schools with regards to how they interpret Anadi Mayaya Shuktaha Yada Jivaha Prabudyate Ajam Anidram Aswapnam Advaitam Budyate Tada. Okay, so let us look at what is the contextual relevance of Advaitam in that verse. Advaita. Let us take two, Dvaita and Advaita. This has got nothing to do with the Vedantic schools of philosophy of Vishishta Dvaita, Dvaita and Advaita. Here what it means is Dvaita means difference, Advaita means non-difference. So what is the difference? Me as a soul and my body are different. So that is Dvaita. Whereas for the Supreme Lord or God, he and his body are the same. They are non-different. He is called Advaita. So the Mula Rupa, the Vyuha forms of the Lord, they are all the same. There is no difference between the avatara forms, Mula Rupa forms of the Lord. He and his body are all the same. That is Advaita. That is the first view of Advaita. The second view of Advaita is relevant for our discussion because Dvaita means Dvi Ita. Dvi means two. Ita means Jnana. So there are two types of knowledge, true knowledge and false knowledge. False notion, knowing wrongly. Knowing wrongly is what is called Ayatartha Jnana or Viparita Jnana. So Advaita means he who removes ignorance and gives true knowledge. So that is a second meaning of Advaita, which is the contextual relevance for our discussion on ignorance, because the Supreme Brahman is called Advaita because he removes this knowledge of Ayatartha Jnana and Viparita Jnana, or the false knowledge. And when Chandogya Upanishad, we have done this before, right? Sadeva Somya Idamagra Asid Ekameva Advitiyam. So there Advitiyam means one without a second. He is the supreme most Lord of the universe. There is nobody equal to him. There is nobody superior to him. It does not mean that other entities don't exist. Other entities exist, but they are inferior to him and they are under his control. So that is what Advitiyam there means. So there are three different angles to Advaita, which is what you need to take from a realistic school perspective. So this is what is going on. If Jiva, this is an important question for you to think about. If Jivas are non-material, but they are self-luminous, how can ignorance, which is material, penetrate its inner core and lead to ignorance of its inherent nature and the presence of independent Antaryamin? Yeah. So this is the highest levels of philosophical discussion that you can have in this view. So that makes sense, isn't it? Jivas we know is non-material. But if Jivas are non-material, how could something material either penetrates its inner core or covers it and gives ignorance? Okay. So when you look at Jivas, they are self-luminous in the sense that a Jiva like you and me, we know that we exist. You cannot say we don't exist. We are conscious beings. Jiva, the presence of consciousness, is the symptom of the soul. At least that is a theistic view, that consciousness is a symptom of souls, and we know that we exist. And the Jiva knows that it is the experiencer, and the Jiva knows it is a doer. All that the ignorance for the Jiva is that it thinks that it is an independent doer and it is an independent experiencer. Okay, that is one of its ignorance. What is the other ignorance? Attachment to the material world, because this Linga Sharira is so close to it. It is almost, it's always there with it. It gets so entangled with it and it assumes that this material body is itself and that it is actually different from it. It is not able to discriminate. So that is another component of cosmic ignorance. Okay. The other side is, what is it that the Jivas does not know? The Jiva does not know the Supreme, who is the Antaryamin, who is sitting right inside. It does not know that he is actually dependent on this Antaryamin who is sitting inside. He does not know his full nature. We as Jivas, we know we may exist, but we actually do not know what our real nature is. Are we Sattvic? Are we a combination of Sattvic and Rajasic? Are we Sattvic and Rajasic and Tamasic? We actually do not know is the fundamental truth. That knowledge of what our true nature itself happens during the process of our spiritual journey. Okay. And of course, the ultimate culmination of that is that we experience bliss. But in the current state of samsara, the Jiva does not experience bliss or the Swarupa Ananda. How is this happening within the Jiva? The answer from a theistic school, it is this Antaryamin who is sitting inside the Jiva, who with his Achintya Adbhuta Shakti, his omnipotency, his extraordinary power that you and I cannot comprehend, it is that supreme being with that extraordinary power is able to bring this concealment of this particular, giving this ignorance to the souls, using Prakriti as a upadana karana, or a material cause for this. Okay, and there are also other concepts called para, adina, vishesha, apti, and I don't think we have time for all that. We'll skip that particular philosophy, but I hope you understand what is that concept of ignorance, cosmic ignorance and ignorance in the material platform, and how they are evolving in the realistic schools. Okay, so there is the Linga Sharira, there is the Jiva, there is the Antaryamin. The Linga Sharira has karmic imprints. It also has the cosmic ignorance, which leads to this problem for the soul.
HinduKnowledgeAcademy.com will celebrate Vedic culture and present its philosophies to the modern Hindu in an accessible format. Our ancient heritage is our greatest strength. Through preservation and dissemination, together let us spread positivity in the world. Thank you for listening and welcome to Hindu Knowledge Academy.